Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Chevy Chase at Home Speakers Forum. My name is John Itzty. I'm a member of the Chevy Chase at Home Board of Directors. We're excited to see such a strong turnout today and anxious to reintroduce you to author and award-winning journalist David Shipler, who will speak to us about uh, the current challenges to the U.S. Constitution. But first, a couple of words about Chevy Chase at Home. As most of you already know, it's a community building organization that engages our neighbors with social and educational programming, both in person and virtually. We also provide volunteer services to older adults who need assistance, including rides, errands, tech support, household assistance, and just friendly visits. If you haven't already, we urge you to consider joining Chevy Chase at Home or your local village if you live outside our area and become a member or a volunteer. Now, on to our program. David K. Shipler is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 10 books and a former New York Times correspondent in Saigon, Moscow, Jerusalem, and Washington. He also produced, wrote, and narrated two PBS documentaries on the Arab-Israeli conflict and has taught at Princeton, Dartmouth, American University, and the University of Southern California. His book of poetry, The Wind is Invisible, was published in 2023. His latest book, The Interpreter, is a novel set at the end of the Vietnam War 50 years ago. I'm reading it now, and it's a fascinating book. I highly recommend it. And David has a collection of short stories titled The Unfinished Sentence that is scheduled to be published in the spring of 2026. David also writes online at the Shipler Report and co-hosts a podcast, Two Reporters, which I also highly recommend. Um, Given the subject of today's Speakers Forum, challenges to the U.S. Constitution, we should point out that several of David's 10 books have focused on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Following his presentation, he'll take a few of your questions. You may write them in the chat section, and I'll relay them to David, or use the hands up function, and I'll call on you. David, it is a pleasure to have you back with us. Please proceed.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it very much. Nice to be here and see so many people participating. So this is not a cheerful subject. So if you tuned in to get cheer, you're going to be disappointed. I'm sure you didn't. And it's often appropriate talking about democracy, the Constitution, the state of American liberty to begin with a quote from a founding father, usually one that contains thunderous eloquence. So let me start with Alexander Hamilton, who wrote something in the Federalist Papers pretty relevant to today. History will teach us, he wrote, that of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the great number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. What I think is useful today in talking about this is to differentiate between policy and process. That is, between the public policies that the Trump administration is following and the constitutional processes which it is often ignoring. Some of those policies could not be implemented without trampling on the constitutional protections and the general norms of democracy. But policies can change from administration to administration. The damage done to the democratic process, I think, is probably going to be longer lasting and more difficult to repair. You can see this, the policy issues in the draconian deportations, the brutal arrests and confinements of immigrants, in the cutoff of foreign aid, and the use of research grants as a bludgeon against institutions that may displease the administration in other ways besides their actual research. So, but all of those policies could be changed. They could be revised with the next administration. They could be changed with a congressional act and so forth. I mean, right now, the Trump administration is ignoring, for example, the appropriations process that Congress has carefully and often laboriously and messily created. And that certainly is a violation of the democratic and constitutional norms. The policy changes are not particularly surprising if you have read any of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. That outlined a lot of the policies. It was much less specific about the processes, except in the use of unrelated federal grants as weapons. That the some of the authors of some of the chapters did, in fact, advocate. I haven't read all 900 pages. I read enough to be impressed by how expert the authors were in the way certain agencies operate. Many of them had worked in federal agencies. They understand where the levers of power are. So they have implemented some of those practices, sidestepping the legislative process. I think the outcomes are less dangerous than the means used to implement them. You know, the jewel in the crown of American democracy is a creation of the framers of the Constitution that was very unusual, perhaps unique at the time. The creation of three co-equal branches of government that were designed to check each other and balance each other's power. James Madison at the Constitutional Convention said, this is a paraphrase by memory, but pretty close to this, all men having power ought to be distrusted to a certain extent. And I think that's basically was the spirit in which the structure of the American government was created. What's happened since Trump came in last January is that the executive branch has been pretty much ignoring the legislative branch, cutting off funds that had been duly appropriated, eliminating the creation of agencies that were set up by Congress. And the legislative branch, as you know, the Congress has been supine in terms of resisting. The Republican majority in both houses, for whatever reasons, we could get into that, but that's a political question, have not exercised their authority to push back, even rhetorically in most cases. The judiciary has been very active at the lower court levels. That is, district court judges, by and large, have been ruling against Trump in many of these areas. But either they've been ignored, their orders have sometimes been ignored, especially in the immigration area, or on appeal, they've been overturned by the Supreme Court, whose membership includes six right-wing justices. I think the word conservative is probably a misnomer. I don't know what they're conserving. They're certainly not conserving constitutional democracy or the separation of powers. And most of those six have been very keen for many years to enable a very strong presidency. So we've seen ruling after ruling to, underscore the power of the what do they call the unitary executive. Now, this whole movement, so to speak, and it's a big movement inside the United States, and it's it's been very rapid. This whole movement fits very closely with the playbook of other democracies that have been killed by democratic means. This has sometimes been called competitive authoritarianism. This is a term that has been used by two Harvard professors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in in some op-ed pieces they've written. They're really experts on authoritarianism and how democracies are undermined. One of their books is really worth reading. It's called How Democracies Die, and it looks at other countries that have used democracy to create autocracy. Hungary and Turkey are examples of what they call the competitive authoritarianism, by which they mean you have an opposition party, but it has really no chance of gaining power because of all kinds of methodology that is used to undermine its electoral possibilities. They believe that the United States has now entered this phase of its history, that it is a competitive authoritarian system. Uh, Levitsky and Ziblatt have a very interesting argument. They note that while military coups were responsible for establishing most despotic regimes during the Cold War, now it's really different. Since the Cold War, what's happened is that democracies have been dying at the hands, not of generals, as they say, but of elected leaders, presidents or prime ministers who subvert the very process that brought them to power. And we can look at a couple of cases that are illustrative and I think shed some light on what's happening in the United States. We take a case from the left and a case from the right. So we'll look at Venezuela and Hungary. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez tried and failed to stage a military coup in 1992, but then came back and won a free election in 1998. He had enough seats by his party in parliament to rewrite the Constitution, giving him control over three branches of government. The National Assembly passed a law giving him the power to rule by decree. He appointed all new Supreme Court justices, and then he won a landslide victory in the election of 2006. He closed the major TV station. He arrested opposition politicians and judges, eliminated term limits, and essentially put the media under government control. And yet, most Venezuelans didn't seem to mind this. In 2011, there was a poll that found 51% of Venezuelans rating their democracy 8 or higher on a scale of 1 to 10. So there is a thirst in some populations for a strong man at the top, especially when there's anarchy or disruption, economic hardship, or so forth. And democracy is messy, it's contentious. It doesn't seem to be working for a lot of people. So in that kind of a setting, you can get people gravitating toward the idea of an authoritarian leader. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, who's still the leader, began as a liberal Democrat in the late 1980s and morphed into a semi-autocrat. He packed the Constitutional Court by expanding its members from 8 to 15, and he changed the rules so his party could appoint judges unilaterally. His party, Fidesz party, won 2/3 of the seats in 2010 and used its supermajority to change the Constitution and the electoral laws to lock in its advantage. There was a lot of gerrymandering, banning of campaign ads in any but the government-run TV station. So Viktor Orban is now ruling as what you might call a semi-autocrat, semi-dictator. By the way, it's important to note that Trump loves Orban. He's hosted him at Mar-a-Lago. Trump has indulged in a rhapsody of praise about Viktor Orban. One quote I found was Trump saying, "There's nobody that's better, smarter, or a better leader than Viktor Orban. He's fantastic." So that gives you some sense of the kind of leader Trump admires. Now, if you look at what you might call the playbook for demolishing or undermining democracy through democratic means, there are basically four warning signs, according to the authors I was quoting, Levitsky and Ziblatt. So here they are, basically, the four warning signs. The leader rejects democratic rules or norms, denies the legitimacy of opponents, tolerates or encourages violence, and indicates willingness to curtail civil liberties, especially those of opponents, including the liberties of the media. So there are steps in this playbook which are followed pretty routinely in countries where democracy is used to undermine democracy. And these steps are will be very familiar to any American who's been watching what happens. The first one is particularly interesting, I think, and that is that you need a political party that fails, a major political party that fails to filter out extremist demagogues or outsider populists. And these kinds of politicians do arise from time to time in well-established democracies. So between the two world wars, for example, Belgium and Finland both faced such people, and their major parties screened them out. In the United States, it's happened. Henry Ford was an anti-Semite who railed against Jewish bankers and Bolsheviks, and who was rather popular in the United States. He scored very high in a straw poll conducted by Collier's magazine. But he was also mentioned by Hitler in Mein Kampf, and he was awarded the Grand Cross of German Eagle in 1938. But leaders of both the Democratic and Republican parties, despite Henry Ford's popularity, really screened him out of any contention for nomination for the presidency. Charles Lindbergh was an anti-Semite. He was awarded a medal by Goering, but his name never surfaced in the 1940 Republican convention. Uh, by the way, if you've read Philip Roth's novel, The Plot Against America, you have a hypothetical, counterfactual account of what would happen, what would have happened had Charles Lindbergh become president. Joseph McCarthy got support from nearly half of Americans, but the Republican Party never allowed him to get to the center of Republican politics. Even though he was tolerated for many years, ultimately he was spat out, you could say, by the Republicans. 40% of Americans approved of George Wallace, but the Democratic Party never allowed George Wallace to be a serious contender for the presidential nomination. Now, in those years, mostly, there were smoke-filled rooms where those decisions were made. We don't have that anymore. We have primaries, for better or worse. And in our society, the gatekeepers have changed. Now they're not the bosses, the political bosses in the back room. They're the partisan press, the social media influencers, the biased commentators, all amplified by social media. So that is the first major thing that has to happen for you to move to a somewhat autocratic system. Of course, we've seen that in the Republican Party here, which is no longer at all like the Republican Party of my youth, not like the Rockefeller Party or the Jacob Javits Party. It's a party that is beholden to Trump. Many members are afraid, physically afraid, of confronting him. Marjorie Taylor Greene has just said recently that one of the reasons she is resigning from Congress is that after Trump called her a traitor, she was threatened seriously with pipe bombs. Her son was threatened. And so this is the kind of politics we have. And this is something that happens in both directions now, but mostly in terms of the intimidation of politicians, mostly from the right against people who may break ranks with Trump. Now, there are some additional features of Trumpism that I have to bring up because of my 4 years living in the Soviet Union in the era of communism. And those were the years 75 to 79. Excuse me. So there are some elements that I found in the Soviet Union that have echoes now today. And some of them actually began under the Bush II administration. I wrote a whole chapter in one of my civil liberties book actually about the political vetting that was being done for hiring officials in positions where there was no politics involved in their work. So lawyers for the Justice Department would be asked, what do you think about abortion? How are you going to advance the president's agenda? This was under Bush too. And that seed of politicization has now, of course, blossomed into a wholesale weed patch of vetting and screening in the administration, in which I think the major objective is not only to dismiss people who are at odds with the president's agenda, but then to replace them, to fill those vacancies with people who are zealots and very much in tune with a particular political view that is not necessarily in accord with their obligations under the law or the purpose of the administration's or the agency's uh, mission. So there are a couple of things about the Soviet Union that I'm reminded of here. One is the manipulation of information. In the Soviet Union, information was a monopoly of the government. This is not yet the case in the United States, but the government does actually control a great deal of information, economic information, health information, so forth. And it's clear that those controls are being used to manipulate, stifle, erase, maybe create. I'm not sure manufacturing information is yet going on, but I think there's definitely a chance that that will happen. It certainly happens in the Oval Office all the time. But you remember that the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics was fired after the agency did what it always does every month, which is to revise the numbers of job creation, so forth. I mean, there are always errors that have to be corrected. The head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I think two other people were dismissed after the DIA issued a preliminary report following the bombing attack on Iran that differed from what Trump had said. He said that the nuclear capability was obliterated. The DIA said, well, maybe not so fast. It doesn't look as if it was really completely obliterated. And so they got canned. So you have, and I'm sure this is happening throughout the government, you have a whole idea that negative information or information that contradicts what the president has said or what his trusted aides want people to believe is screened out, and those who pass it up are in jeopardy. This is a very common malady of dictatorships. It creates a pinnacle of ignorance on which the dictator sits, screened from reality, indulgent of his own creation and of reality and fantasies. We've certainly seen how Trump creates imaginary crises and then moves to solve them in an imaginary way. I mean, the boat strikes in Venezuela outside on Venezuelan waters are a perfect example of this. The supposed crime in American cities are a great example of how you bring in the National Guard who stand around looking awkward, not really doing much of anything except being targets, obviously, for crazies. And, then Trump can claim that he's brought peace and security to the cities. So there's a whole um, informational fantasy that was very much the case in the Soviet Union. In fact, the KGB, the secret police in the Soviet Union, had to conduct clandestine polling to find out what people really thought, because what they really thought, they didn't dare to say out loud. The bureaucracy in the Soviet Union was all-encompassing. It was a socialist system, so there weren't competing centers of information. And that bureaucracy was a good news bureaucracy. Good news was passed up the chain of command. So by the time it got to the top, to the Politburo, it was sanitized. I think this is happening in the United States. It will continue to get worse because, of course, people who want to keep their jobs are afraid. They're afraid of telling the truth when the truth does not happen to coincide with what the dear leader wants to believe. Another element of Soviet society, which I feel a certain resonance about, is the totalitarian mindset that I found in the Soviet Union. There was an aspiration to totalitarianism. If you want to see totalitarianism as an intolerance of dissent, as an embrace of the idea that there is a single truth, and that the narrow ideology must be spread not only within government, but throughout civil society. This is exactly the Trumpists' viewpoint. They are not tolerant of dissent or discussion or disagreement. Trump calls people who disagree traitors, the enemy within. And it's disturbing because when I was in Moscow, one of the things that happens when you're in another country is that you see your own more clearly. And what I saw from Moscow, looking back at the United States, was an American uh, regard not for the single idea, but for the din of many ideas. That, to me, was always absolutely central to the American purpose and the American culture. We debate, we disagree, we shout at each other. And that is something that the Trumpists cannot tolerate. And they are moving very quickly in particular areas to silence people who disagree. DEI is a perfect example of this, where they've sown fear throughout the society, even among institutions that actually do embrace the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. My heavens, those are positive words. And yet they've become a kind of curse. So people are shredding their papers. They are censoring these terms out of their research. They're changing the names of their offices. And this goes not just in government. This is goes deeply into civil society, which makes this a totalitarian aspiration into the arts, into universities, into secondary schools, into businesses, into law firms. Now, there's a patchwork of resistance alongside a patchwork of accommodation. Many institutions are negotiating with the administration for their own parochial interests to protect themselves. Some universities have done this. Media organizations have done it. So you don't see the massive pushback and massive resistance that one might have thought at one time would have happened in American society, which so treasures, supposedly, its liberties. So that's the second element of that's reminiscent to me of Soviet society. Now, obviously, people are not being arrested. Citizens, U.S. citizens, are not yet being arrested for their dissent. I think there's a good chance that that will start to happen. But that's another discussion about the future, and it's speculative. So I don't think I'm going to go there unless people want me to. What I'm discussing now is what's actually happened, what we can actually see. Another element of Soviet society that I see happening here is what I would call peer enforcement. That is, there are coworkers and supervisors who will enforce the conformity on themselves and on their colleagues. It doesn't necessarily require direct vertical commands from the very top, for example, to get the National Park Service to take away plaques that state historical facts about slavery, for example. Um, it doesn't necessarily take the president himself to provide the service academies with a list of 300 books that should be removed from the library. There are people around him and people lower down who are complicit and eager, apparently, or afraid not to accommodate. And this is very, very Soviet. In the Soviet Union, there was censorship of their own press, but I think there were very few. I know, in fact, having talked to editors and journalists there were very few occasions where the censor had to do anything because the limits were internalized. People understood instinctively where they could go and where they couldn't go in what they wrote about. So this is happening in the United States, not universally, but certainly it's happening in certain institutions where you would hope, you would think that there would be a kind of rebellion. I mean, some of the big corporations that own media organizations have settled for a lot of money with Trump because of frivolous libel suits, which could never win in court. They could never win under existing precedent, not a chance. In fact, they probably, if they got to court, would be dismissed by any responsible judges. So that accommodation and then the anticipation of problems, the anticipation of censorship leads to self-censorship, which is very hard to document because you can't really see it. It's invisible. So that's another area in which the Soviet system, a kind of a very mild version of the Soviet system at this point, uh, is a reminder to me. I mean, I saw it all the time. If somebody said something, or even went to church in the Soviet Union, uh, you know, the, the KGB wasn't necessarily going to be on their backs. The Komsomol, the Young Communist League, would call a meeting, and they would condemn the person. They would try to persuade the person of their own, kind of wayward, behavior. So there was that. It wasn't vertical enforcement always; it was horizontal enforcement as well. Now, it's been said that many people are in the United States are now afraid to criticize the government publicly because they think they might have some problems as a result. I know a woman who has two daughters who are public school teachers in New York City who are afraid to go to demonstrations because they're afraid their pictures will be taken and they'll be fired. Now, under very well-established legal precedent, they have the First Amendment right to demonstrate and express their political views without any recourse by their government employees, as long as they're not representing their school or their agency or if it's a personal political act, they're protected by the First Amendment. But they're not going to go to court. They're not going to risk it. So that's the atmosphere that's being spread quite deliberately by the Trumpists who want to pervade the civil society as extensively as possible with a narrow ideology of intolerance about history, about the present, and so forth. So we're going to see a lot more of this because they've been successful. There have been too many institutions that have tried to make deals with them. And you can't make deals with an autocrat. Uh, Anyone who's studied this knows that very well. But they're trying to do it. And one of the problems here also is that the resistance, such as it is, and there's a lot of pushback and among lawyers and others, is working within the constitutional system, whereas Trump is working outside the constitutional system. The courts at the lower levels, as I said, have been very active and vigorous, but the courts are not going to save us. Is politics going to save us? Will the next election be fair? Will it be open? Will the opposition party really be able to gain power? Or are we already in that shadow area that the experts have written about of a competitive authoritarian system? Well, we'll see next year. We've already seen very vigorous efforts to manipulate the elections with redistricting and gerrymandering. It's something that is unprecedented practically unprecedented between censuses, but it's been going on. And of course, now the Supreme Court enables it because the Supreme Court is uh, is very, very interested in, I think the right-wing judges, very interested in promoting their particular policy views. They're really not acting as judges so much as uh, but more as legislators or executors of a particular set of policies. I've often thought that it's too bad the Supreme Court justices and other government leaders aren't required to live for 2 or 3 years in some dictatorship before they take office in the United States, or better yet, in one of the countries that have used democracy to undermine democracy, because then maybe they'd recognize the signs of a gathering storm. Uh, but these folks uh, are, I think, not clear on what's happening and what might happen. Uh, they don't seem to understand that the the structure that they're creating can be used by a left-wing autocrat in the White House as well as by a right-wing autocrat. I mean, if a left-wing president comes into office, the first thing they're going to have to do is purge the federal agencies. They're going to have to sweep away all the commissioners of the independent agencies who've been replaced by Trump, and which the Supreme Court is poised to allow him to do, except maybe the Federal Reserve, because they like money. They're concerned about that. Otherwise, the other agencies are certainly vulnerable to Trump coming in and dismissing the commissioners. No matter that Congress has a statute, passed a statute saying there has to be cause. And once again, the Supreme Court is allowing the legislative branch to be undermined. Uh, I think that they are not conservative, as I said. I don't know, the term conservative is really a misnomer. We need to think of a different word for the Trumpists. They are not trying to conserve. They are trying to radically uh, revise. They're, and I think if it were during the American Revolution, they'd be monarchists. Uh, they'd be loyalists. They're now maybe they're counter-revolutionaries. We don't have good vocabulary to describe them. But it's very important to see that the Supreme Court and the Republican Party are laying the ground for autocracy. They are corrupting the constitutional interplay among the three branches of government. That um, undermines the shared and competing interests in a complex society, and therefore among the rulers and the ruled. A journalist I was in touch with recently, who's an active journalist now, um, who used to be in Moscow after me. He was there in the early years of Gorbachev. I'm sorry, early years of Putin, actually. Uh, Gorbachev and then Putin. And he had an interesting conversation with a Russian he knows who said to him, "You Americans caved faster than we Russians did." I mean, the Russians did resist in the early years of Putin. They organized, they demonstrated. The retribution was severe. I think the reason is that they knew what was coming because they'd lived in it before. And what has come in Putin's Russia is in some ways even worse than the Soviet communist system where I lived in for 4 years in the late 70s. The more liberal element of that is that people can leave Russia. They couldn't then. But people were not being arrested in the Soviet Union for a casual remark in a cafe, which they are now. So Putin has really tightened up and damaged his country. And Putin seems to get some admiration from Trump. It's a little complicated to know why and what he sees in Putin, except he likes strong men. I think that it's possible that if history is honest 100 years from now, it will look back on this period with some harsh judgment and ask the question, what if all the law firms fought back instead of trying to negotiate a combination? What if all universities had fought back instead of negotiating their own parochial interests to protect their grants? What if all the media fought Trump's frivolous libel suits instead of trying to buy him off? What if all business executives, understanding that they profit through an open democratic system, what if they stood together in opposition to the undemocratic means being employed? What if all Americans turned out week after week in the streets to demand the preservation of their democracy? That's not happening. There is no broad resistance. There are pockets of resistance, mostly relying on the courts, which, as I said, I doubt can save us. So I'll stop there and be happy to hear comments, questions. If you want to say something to cheer me up, I'd be delighted.
Thank you, David. Thank you for a provocative and challenging and alarming presentation. I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask the first question. And that is there something about our constitutional structure that has made us vulnerable to moving in an autocratic direction? Was there something that could have been done by the founders, or could we have arranged things so that we weren't so vulnerable, or is it something outside of that has made us vulnerable to this situation?
Well, I think one thing that's made us I don't know about the structure because the structure is quite good if it were adhered to. I remember on my podcast I do with Danny's Wordling, we interviewed Walter Shaub recently. He used to head the White House Office of Government Ethics, and he made a really interesting point about corruption, which is rampant, in the Trump administration and the higher levels. He said, the laws are not as strong as the norms. The norms really shamed officials and brought retribution and forced resignations when they transgressed the rules, the laws on corruption. I think the same is true with the democratic system. It turns out, and maybe I was a little surprised by this. It turns out it's pretty fragile, and it depends on norms, and it depends on people kind of staying on the right hand side of the road and stopping at stop signs and observing the red lights and doing all the things that drivers do to keep themselves safe. And now we have leaders, and not just Trump, but he's got a lot of people around him who have absolutely no respect for those norms and are just running roughshod over them. So we have a kind of we have a lot of education to do in this country about that. I think that I think our school system has failed to teach American children about democracy and how it works, what the constitutional system is all about, and how people ought to behave within its bounds. So education is one part of it, certainly. So I think that, I think the framers did what they could and they set up a really good system. They were also, some of them, quite aware that it was not a given, not divinely ordained, that the system would hold together forever, and that you could have a demagogue come along and take it apart. And that's exactly what's happening.
I see a hand raised here. John Mazel, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask, do you think that there's any kind of um impetus on among the Democrats to do similar things, or do you think that they that when if and when Democrats or under Democratic leadership, the other party could potentially take this in another direction without kind of deconstructing this sort of anti-democratic impulse in American politics right now? Do you think that Um, and do you think that that would look any different? Um, I hope I'm making sense, but
Thanks, John.
Well, uh,
David, go ahead.
well, I don't know. I mean, I have a sense that most most voters in the country, especially those who are independent, so to speak, are concerned about their economic situation, and that the democracy issue is a bit abstract. I mean, they might be, many people I think are find the ICE actions repugnant. They don't like that, but they don't, and Trump has very low approval ratings. But in terms of actually voting for Democrats, my impression is, and I'm no political reporter, so I don't know, but my impression is that the Democrats need to persuade voters of a plan, a series of ambitions to make the American economy work for everybody. It doesn't work for everybody. So people are concerned, and you know it's hard. The hardship of living in a situation where you're not able to, um, first of all, depend on the security of your job. And I think this really began in 2008, in the Great Recession, when people lost jobs that they felt were secure and they got underwater on their mortgages, and all of a sudden they felt very vulnerable. And when people are vulnerable, they'll reach for easy answers very often. And the easy answer is a strong man who has a big mouth and promises all kinds of stuff, and that's what they've got. So I think that I'd like to see the Democrats going into red states and red congressional districts and really campaign hard on the importance of government aid to people who otherwise might have voted for Trump. You know, I've had just little discussions with folks, and I've made the point that, with Medicaid cuts in rural areas, I mean, you personally might not be on Medicaid, but the chances are that your hospital is, because your hospital relies on those payments in order to sustain itself. And if Medicaid is cut, there's a chance your hospital or local clinic is going to go under, and that has happened. Actually, it happened before, and it's going to continue to happen. And people, so I think there's a whole, a lot of work to be done by Democrats to cultivate some kind of support among rural white voters. And I hate to say this, but putting aside the wedge issues, the cultural issues is probably something they've got to do. I mean, I'm very much in favor of affirmative action. I think the Supreme Court's decision was terrible. I'm very much in favor of all the efforts made over the years. I wrote a whole book called A Country of Strangers about blacks and whites and the intricate racial disharmonies that exist in the society. And I think America was making some progress in that regard, and Trump has just demolished it. And I'm all in favor of LGBTQ rights and trans rights, and how people need to be respected and protected. But I'm not sure any of those issues can win now uh, in a political campaign by Democrats. And it looks to me as if the economic issue is the issue that's going to work for them if they do it right, at least with it for next year's election. I don't know about 2028. That's my feeling.
David, is there something instructive, or how would you analyze the fact that U.S. voters voted for Trump once, they got Trump one, and there were some whiffs of what are experiencing now. Then they voted him out of office, and they voted him back into office. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I think part of it is, it's a lot of people I've talked to vote uh, from their gut about seeing it as a choice between two candidates, and often two personalities, rather than two sets of policies. And I think that the Democratic problem was Joe Biden, who withdrew too late, displayed, real cognitive problems in his debate. Kamala Harris, I think would have made a good president, but she got a late start in her campaign. There were things she did wrong that she could have corrected. I mean, I was reminded when she answered that question, what would you do differently, or what did you do wrong in the administration? And she said, I can't think of anything. I was reminded of Hubert Humphrey in 1968 during an upsurge in anti-war activity, especially among Democratic voters and Humphrey just, would not criticize Lyndon Baines Johnson, his president. Humphrey was vice president. And yet I happen to know that Humphrey opposed the Vietnam War at one point and thought we couldn't win it. I know it because I worked as an assistant for James Reston. This can now be told. And I remember Reston coming back from lunch with Humphrey, who was vice president, and saying, Reston was kind of stunned. And he said, Humphrey opposes the war and he doesn't think we can win it, but I can't write it because he put it off the record. And this was in the spring of 1967. More than a year before the election. And only 2 weeks before the election in 1968 did Humphrey actually come out with, and I don't remember what the statement was, but some disagreement with the war because he was loyal to LBJ. I think that Kamala Harris suffered from the same syndrome. I think she could have differentiated herself from Biden in a quite dignified and responsible way. I don't know if it would have made a difference, but it certainly would have not hurt. And so that was one problem. And she got a late start, and it was, the whole Democratic side of the ticket was a disaster, and people were not voting, obviously, they were choosing between two personalities almost. And there are a lot of people who like Trump's personality. He has a certain charisma. Doesn't appeal to me, but he has a certain charisma. He has a knack for saying what a lot of people think. He certainly, but maybe don't feel free to say, he certainly taps the ethnocentrism and jingoism and racism that is endemic in parts of American society. I mean, Trump and his people are blatant white supremacists and racists, and that doesn't seem to, doesn't go over too badly with a lot of Americans.
We have a
So
number
I
of
think so I think all of that kind of, and the economic issue, I think, was really hurting. People really were struggling, and they didn't see Biden as, rescuing them from that. And Trump makes a lot of huge, big promises, and that appeals to people. I don't know. That's my very kind of simplistic analysis. I don't know if it
we have
makes
a
sense.
lot of questions in our chat room here. Let me ask you this one from Bill. What are your recommendations for having a constructive dialogue on these issues with some of the, 40+% of Americans who support the president and what he's doing?
Well, I think, there are some efforts at a very local level of organizing discussion groups, dinners with people, across the lines. Um, it's probably they probably need facilitating with skill because they can degenerate into shouting matches. But I think that if you begin with what we all agree on, and I assume that all the people on various sides love their country and want the best for it, then you can go into areas where you find overlap, I think. And then from there, when you get to know that the other person really does care about a lot of the same things you care about, uh, then you can maybe move into some sort of a dialogue that's productive. I don't know. Um, I think you also need mass media to do this. And unfortunately, our media, especially broadcast and media online, are so highly polarized that it's very difficult to create that kind of dialogue. It could be, I mean, it could be done if the organizations were willing to do it.
Wendy Pachter has her hand raised. Wendy, you want to ask a question?
Thank you. I actually have more thoughts too, since I wrote the question in the chat. But I guess my question and what I'm thinking is, um, well, two things. One is thank you. This was a really helpful presentation. And I also think it would be nice to have a follow-up about what has happened in country that has enabled countries that have gone through this and become totalitarian to come back, like Poland and other countries that have managed to get out of it.
Hmm.
Because I sort of saw this coming in when Trump was about to be in office the first time. And I said to a friend who is an ardent Democrat and has been very, I mean, we both were involved in on the Hill and in government institutions. And he thought the Democrats could take care of this. And I really didn't feel that this was something that a political party could take care of because it was just too polarized. And it was, as you said, it was a matter of our citizens not understanding our country and how it works and what their responsibilities are. And so I have a question for you, but I'm also feeling there are much bigger forces than just who the candidate is. The candidate is important, but there were people working hard for years across the world, but certainly in the United States to make this happen. It wasn't a matter of one or two elections. This has been coming for a long time as a result of people who have been orchestrating outside the system and across the world for a repressive sort of right-wing takeover.
Wendy, could we get your question, please?
Okay, so the question, sorry about that. I'd be interested.
I think you're right. I think you're right, actually. Yeah,
but I do wonder whether it's and this is a real question. Is it common in this kind of scenario in other countries for there to be a state religion like white Christian nationalism that helps to either make this happen or hold it together by letting the party in power demonize, to round up, feelings of other that are demons versus us who are on a holy crusade?
So that's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I would say that, of course, in Poland, you may remember the anti-communist movement had a Catholic Church element to it. So that went the other way. In Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church, from the time of the czars, has really been under the thumb of the government. It was co-opted during the communist period, and Putin has become religious. They're now icons over the Kremlin gates. I saw when I was there last time, which really blew my mind. But so I think that using religion, and Trump, Putin actually does use religion quite effectively to mobilize Russian nationalism. So I think there is an intersection in that society. Countries like Venezuela, which it's basically a Catholic country. I don't know what the role of the church was in this, the institution of the church in the takeover. I'm not familiar with that. But I think that there is, I would say that religion is often a vessel for national identity. So in Armenia, for example, the Armenian church was always, even under Soviet, domination, when Armenia was a Soviet republic, the Armenian church was, in fact, a very important reservoir or vehicle of Armenian identity. In Azerbaijan, which is a Muslim culture, Islam also was, although it was much more circumspect and suppressed and guarded against by the Russians. And so forth. So, I mean, every republic in the Soviet Union had a different religious background. But I don't, on the Christian nationalism issue, I can't say clearly whether there's a parallel in other countries to this. I mean, but I do think you're right this is a long-standing and broad effort that goes beyond the particular candidate. Um, yeah.
We have time for one more question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up. But this is from Bob Liebenfeld. How do you put the genie back in the bottle if Democrats retake the White House in 2028? And they start to purge, as you suggested earlier.
Well, there is a danger that we're going to go flipping back and forth from one extreme to the other, like a banana republic. And it's ironic that the Supreme Court seems to be okay with that, since
Yeah.
in their decision overturning the Chevron case, which was the case in which precedent in which when there was an ambiguity in the law involving regulations, regulatory agencies were entitled to interpret it and implement it, and their expertise would be deferred to. But the Supreme Court overturned that. One of their arguments of the right wingers was, well, we're going to have, just every administration is going to have different rules. Well, now they're allowing the president to sweep aside the commissioners of these independent agencies, which have been a mark of stability. So it's obvious that a Democratic president, even a Democratic president who's faithful to the norms of democracy, will have to do a lot of that uh, purging. Now, the risk, it seems to me, is I'm not sure, I don't know how real this risk is, but certainly a risk is that you get a Democrat in the White House who is a demagogue, who is dogmatic, who is ideological, who's zealous, and who sees now the opportunity to use the federal government to propel the entire country in a particular direction that would be the opposite of what the Trumpists have done. And then you have a situation of a flip-flop, a pendulum back and forth, back and forth. I think that, one scenario, which, may be far-fetched, is, beginning with the understanding that as I said, the economy does not work for millions and millions of Americans. The oligarchy, which has developed in the most obvious way, has got to be offensive to large numbers of people. The remedies for that could be implemented if a Democratic or left-wing president came in and used all the powers that Trump is acquiring, courtesy of the Supreme Court. And that could sweep aside all kinds of rules, regulations, laws. It could be quite dramatic. It could be really a revolution. Now, that might be seen as a good thing by some people. Frankly, I think stability, even though there's got to be reform. I mean, it's just outrageous. The disparity in income and assets has gotten to the point where you wonder how it's going to sustain. I mean, how it's going to be sustained. Is there going to be an uprising? I mean, how do people tolerate this? You think about the French Revolution. It got to the point where it was intolerable. I just started watching last night Ken Burns's series on the American Revolution. And there too, the crown, wasn't satisfied with just this measure or that measure. They kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing until it exploded in their faces. And I just wonder how far the wealthy class in the United States can push and push and push until it explodes in their faces. And if it does, then a Democratic or left-wing president who's dogmatic, who is authoritarian, could remake not just the government, but the economy in a very dramatic way, for better or worse. So I think the United States is heading, we already are in a semi-dictatorship, I think. I think the country is heading into a very unstable period, not just domestically, but in terms of foreign policy. Now, some of that can be rolled back without a lot of difficulty if there's a change in the presidency in 2028. But will there be? I think that the Republicans and the Trumpists are trying very hard to create a situation in which elections are not held on a level playing field. And that's a whole other subject, but it's something that needs to be looked at closely. I know there are lawyers gearing up, to try to prevent that. But I think the chance of a fully free and fair election in which the opposition is seriously able to compete in 2028 is a question. It's a real question. So, there's just so many unknowns at this point that I asked an historian, an American historian, a historian of the South, actually. She's very well versed in what happened during the Civil War. And when I asked her the question, is this what we're going through a phase or a turning point? And her first reaction was a turning point. And then she said, well, it's evolutionary. And that might be the best assessment of it. And it's evolutionary. I don't think it's going to be possible to pull back on the extraordinary powers that the presidency has acquired. No president gives up powers willingly. And anything Congress does is going to have to be signed by the president. So I doubt that you're going to see a wholesale retrenchment back to what it was like in 2024. And by the way, the powers of the presidency have been expanded over the decades anyway. I mean, look at the war powers. We go to war when the president decides to go to war. Congress has nothing to do with it. Sometimes you'll get a kind of a paper permission, like the authorization of force after 9/11, which gets cited and expanded and to extraordinary proportions and as justification for military action. But Congress has become pretty negligible in that particular area. And I think it's going to be really hard for Congress to reassert its authority over even the budget, frankly, now. But anyway, I have a very pessimistic view of the situation, as you can tell.
Yeah. Well, I wish we could end on a happier note, but I don't think it's possible. I guess we'll hope that it is evolutionary. But thanks to you, David, for a fascinating and provocative presentation. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say it was very informative and motivating. And thanks to all of you for joining Chevy Chase at Home for our speaker series and being such a good audience. I invite you to explore other programming listed on our website. You will find the website address now in the chat area. And do consider joining us or your local village as a member or volunteer. Thanks again, David, and thanks again to all of you.
Thanks to all of you for tuning in.